Have you ever found yourself in a conversation where beliefs and worldviews seem like invisible walls, silently dividing people rather than bringing them together? Maybe it was at a family dinner, a workplace, or even among neighbors. In a world that grows more connected every day, these invisible barriers sometimes seem to grow stronger, casting shadows of misunderstanding and distance where warmth and friendship should be. The truth is, whether we realize it or not, we are living in a time when the tapestry of humanity is woven from threads of countless beliefs, traditions, and values. Some of these come from ancient spiritual paths like Buddhism, while others come from completely different religions, or none at all. Each thread is vibrant and meaningful in its own right, but the challenge arises when those threads get tangled, creating tension and sometimes conflict. This tension isn't new, of course. Throughout history, people have struggled to live peacefully with those who hold different views. Yet, in the teachings of Buddhism, there is a gentle and profound wisdom that lights a path through this challenge. A path that invites us not to retreat behind our own beliefs or to argue endlessly, but rather to step forward with openness, compassion, and understanding. Why does this matter? Because at its core, Buddhism is not just about rituals, meditation, or philosophical concepts. It's about the way we relate to all beings. And in a world filled with diverse perspectives, learning how to get along with non-Buddhists is not only a practical necessity but a spiritual practice in itself. Imagine a garden where many different flowers bloom: roses, lilies, orchids, and sunflowers. Each flower thrives in its own unique way, adding color and fragrance to the whole. Yet, the beauty of the garden depends on the harmony of these differences, not on forcing every flower to look or smell the same. Similarly, our communities and relationships flourish when we embrace diversity instead of fearing it. And this is the heart of what we'll explore in this series: how the timeless teachings of Buddhism can guide us to live peacefully and joyfully alongside those whose paths are different from ours. We'll uncover how compassion, mindful speech, and letting go of rigid views can transform potential conflict into connection. We'll see how recognizing our shared humanity can bridge divides and open doors to mutual respect. And we'll discover practical ways to build relationships that honor both our own beliefs and those of others. So, as we begin this journey together, consider this. What if every encounter with someone different became an opportunity, not for debate or defense, but for genuine understanding and kindness? What might happen if the walls between us started to crumble, replaced by bridges of empathy and trust? This is not just a dream. It's a living possibility rooted. There's a profound beauty in diversity, an intricate dance of differences that enrich our lives in ways words often fail to capture. Buddhism, with its timeless wisdom, doesn't just acknowledge this diversity. It invites us to celebrate it, to hold it gently in our hearts with tolerance and respect. At the core of Buddhist teaching is the recognition that all beings, regardless of their beliefs or backgrounds, share a common thread of existence. This thread weaves through every culture, every religion, every individual. It's the essence of life itself, impermanent, interconnected, and deeply precious. The Buddha himself never insisted that everyone follow the exact same path. Instead, he encouraged exploration, self-discovery, and personal experience. His teachings were a guide, not a command. This open-mindedness reflects the spirit of true tolerance, understanding that different paths can lead to awakening in their own way. Tolerance in Buddhism is far from passive acceptance. It is an active, mindful engagement with the world. It's about embracing others with a heart wide enough to hold their differences without judgment or fear. When we practice tolerance, we break down the walls of us versus them and replace them with bridges of mutual respect. But tolerance alone is not enough. Respect goes a step further. It asks us not only to tolerate but to honor the dignity and choices of others. It reminds us that the richness of human experience cannot be reduced to a single viewpoint or tradition. In practical terms, this means listening deeply, without the urge to correct or convert. It means valuing the stories and beliefs that shape others, even when they diverge from our own. This respect creates space for genuine dialogue, a meeting of hearts rather than a battle of opinions. There's a story from the Buddhist tradition that beautifully illustrates this attitude. Once, the Buddha encountered a group of people following a different spiritual practice. Rather than dismissing or debating them, he acknowledged their sincere efforts toward goodness and enlightenment. He recognized that the journey toward awakening can take many forms. This example is a powerful reminder that respect and tolerance aren't signs of weakness or compromise. They are expressions of strength and wisdom, qualities that allow us to live peacefully in a complex, interconnected world. By embracing tolerance and respect, we don't dilute our own faith, we deepen it. We cultivate humility, recognizing that no one holds the entire truth. And in doing so, we open ourselves to learning and growth beyond what we might have imagined. So, the Buddhist attitude toward diversity invites us to step beyond fear and division. It calls us to live with open hearts, ready to honor the beauty in every path. This is not just a lofty ideal. It is a practical foundation for harmonious living. As we continue, we'll explore how compassion and mindful communication build on this foundation, guiding us in everyday interactions that can transform relationships. Compassion isn't just a lofty ideal reserved for monks or spiritual teachers. It's the very heartbeat of our daily lives. When we truly understand compassion, it becomes a practical force, guiding every word we speak and every action we take. And in the delicate art of getting along with non-Buddhists, compassion paired with what Buddhism calls right speech can be transformative. Imagine a moment. You're in a conversation where someone expresses a belief or opinion that clashes with yours. The temptation to argue, to defend, or even to dismiss their view can be strong. But compassion invites us to pause, to see beyond the surface of disagreement and recognize the human experience underneath, the fears, hopes, and struggles that shape their perspective. In Buddhism, compassion is not pity. It is a profound empathy, an active wish to relieve the suffering of others. This starts with truly listening, not just waiting for our turn to speak, but hearing the other person's story with an open heart. When we listen in this way, we create a space where understanding can flourish. Right speech is one of the pillars of the Noble Eightfold Path, and it's more relevant now than ever. It calls us to speak truthfully, kindly, and purposefully. This means avoiding lies, harsh words, gossip, and idle chatter that causes harm. Instead, we choose words that heal, that build trust, and that foster connection. Think about the power of a gentle phrase in a heated discussion. A calm, "I hear you," or "that's an interesting point," can diffuse tension and invite curiosity rather than conflict. It doesn't mean agreeing with everything, but it does mean choosing how we respond with mindfulness and respect. Compassion and right speech together create a ripple effect. When we communicate with care, others often respond in kind. Walls soften, defenses lower, and true dialogue begins. In this space, differences become opportunities for learning rather than reasons for division. There's a beautiful teaching from the Buddha about speech. Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. This reminds us that quality matters more than quantity. Our words carry the potential to wound or to heal, to divide or to unite. Practicing compassion and right speech doesn't come naturally all the time. It's a skill honed through mindfulness, being present with ourselves and others. When frustration or anger rises, mindfulness helps us recognize these emotions before they spill out as harmful words. And it's important to remember, being compassionate with others starts with being compassionate with ourselves. We are all learning, all imperfect. When we forgive our own missteps in communication, we free ourselves to try again with fresh intention. In the delicate dance of Our minds are remarkable, shaping how we see the world and how we respond to it. But one of the greatest obstacles on the path to harmony with others, especially those with different beliefs, is the grip of ego and the attachment to our own views. Ego, in Buddhist understanding, is the sense of a fixed, separate self. The I that clings tightly to identity, opinions, and beliefs as if they define our entire being. This clinging creates a powerful barrier between ourselves and others. When our views become part of who we think we are, any challenge to those views feels like a personal attack. Imagine holding a precious vase, gripping it so tightly that it slips and shatters. The harder we cling to our ideas, the more fragile our peace becomes. This is the paradox of attachment. Trying to protect ourselves only deepens conflict and suffering. Buddhism teaches us the art of letting go, not in the sense of giving up or losing ourselves, but in gently releasing the tight grip of ego and rigid opinions. It's a practice that invites freedom and flexibility, allowing us to navigate relationships with openness rather than defensiveness. When we let go of attachment to our views, we create space for curiosity and learning. We start to see that our beliefs, however deeply held, are just one lens among many. This doesn't mean abandoning what is true for us, but recognizing that truth can be multifaceted. This shift brings a profound humility, a recognition that our understanding is always partial and evolving. It softens the impulse to argue or prove others wrong, and replaces it with the willingness to listen and engage with respect. Letting go of ego also frees us from the need to control or dominate conversations. Instead, we can approach dialogue as an exchange between equals, each offering perspectives without insisting on victory. One of the Buddha's core insights is the impermanence of all things, including our thoughts and beliefs. Just as the seasons change, so do our understandings. Embracing this impermanence helps us release rigid attachments and flow with life's ever-changing nature. Practicing this in everyday life can be challenging. When confronted with opposing views, the pull to defend ourselves is strong. But with mindfulness, we can catch this impulse early and choose a different response, one rooted in openness rather than resistance. This practice doesn't only improve relationships with non-Buddhists, it deepens our own inner peace. When we're not constantly battling to protect our identity, we find a calmness that radiates outward, making connection easier and more genuine. By letting go of ego and attachment to views, we step into a space where true understanding can grow, a place where differences no longer divide, but enrich our shared human experience. From here, our journey leads us to explore practical ways to engage openly, building genuine friendships across beliefs. In the vast tapestry of humanity, differences in belief and tradition often stand out like bright, distinct threads. Yet beneath these surface variations, there exists a profound unity, a shared foundation of values that transcends any one religion or philosophy. When we meet someone whose path seems foreign or unfamiliar, the natural instinct might be to focus on what divides us. But the Buddhist way invites us to look deeper, beyond labels and doctrines, toward the universal qualities that connect us all as human beings. Compassion, kindness, honesty, the desire for peace and happiness, these are values not confined to Buddhism alone. They echo through every culture and faith. Recognizing this common ground becomes a powerful bridge, opening doors to genuine connection and mutual respect. Finding shared values doesn't require agreement on everything. It's about honoring what we have in common and appreciating differences without fear. This approach softens boundaries, reminding us that our humanity is far greater than any particular belief. In practical terms, this means engaging in conversations that focus on universal themes: family, community, well-being, the search for meaning. These topics resonate deeply, creating natural opportunities for empathy and understanding. There's a timeless story about a group of travelers on different paths who discovered they all valued safety, nourishment, and kindness. Even though their journeys varied, their shared needs and hopes became the foundation of lasting friendship. This story mirrors what Buddhism teaches. The essence of our existence is interconnectedness. When we find common ground, we affirm this truth in action, building relationships based on respect and shared humanity. Embracing shared values also strengthens our own practice. It reminds us that Buddhism's wisdom isn't isolated or exclusive, but part of a larger human quest for peace and freedom from suffering. This perspective changes how we approach differences. Instead of seeing them as obstacles, we view them as opportunities to learn, to grow, and to enrich our own understanding. By focusing on what unites rather than divides, we foster harmony not only between Buddhists and non-Buddhists but within ourselves. It's a shift. Understanding and respect are the roots, but how do we nurture these qualities in real life? How can we, as Buddhists, build harmonious relationships with non-Buddhists in the daily rhythms of life? This chapter offers practical guidance, tools that transform wisdom into lived experience. First, embrace the practice of deep listening. Truly listening means giving someone your full attention, setting aside your own agenda, and welcoming their story without interruption or judgment. This simple act can open doors that words alone cannot. Second, cultivate patience. Differences in belief or worldview may sometimes trigger frustration or impatience. Remember, patience is not passive resignation. It is a powerful form of strength. It allows space for growth, change, and understanding. Third, practice humility. Recognize that we do not have all the answers and that others' perspectives may hold wisdom we have yet to discover. Approaching conversations with humility invites openness and genuine dialogue. Next, be mindful of your language. Use words that invite rather than alienate. Avoid debates that seek to win, and instead focus on sharing and learning. Gentle honesty combined with kindness can soften even the most tense exchanges. Another tip is to find shared activities or interests beyond religious discussions. Whether it's volunteering, community projects, or simple social gatherings, these shared experiences build bonds that transcend beliefs and nurture friendship. Also, remember to respect boundaries. Not every conversation needs to explore spiritual topics. Sometimes, honoring the comfort zones of others is the greatest form of respect. In addition, cultivate compassion for yourself when things don't go perfectly. Relationships are a journey filled with learning curves. Each encounter is an opportunity to practice and grow. Finally, maintain your own practice. Your inner peace and clarity become a beacon that naturally attracts understanding and harmony. When you embody the teachings, you inspire others without needing to convince them. These practical steps may seem small, but they carry immense power. They transform moments of potential conflict into opportunities for connection, turning differences into bridges rather than walls. With these tools in hand, we step confidently toward relationship. Our journey together has unfolded like a gentle river, flowing from understanding, through compassion, to practical wisdom. At its heart lies a simple yet profound truth. Living in harmony with others, regardless of their beliefs, is not just an ideal. It's a way of life that deepens our own peace and enriches the world around us. Harmony begins within. When we cultivate kindness, patience, and openness in our own hearts, these qualities naturally extend outward, touching every encounter. We learn that others are not obstacles or threats, but fellow travelers walking their unique paths. In embracing diversity, we honor the vast richness of human experience. Differences become invitations, not to conflict, but to growth, empathy, and connection. Buddhism's timeless wisdom guides us to see beyond surface divisions and recognize the shared essence that binds us all. Living harmoniously does not mean losing ourselves or compromising our beliefs. Rather, it is about holding them lightly, with humility and respect, while opening space for others to do the same. This balance fosters relationships rooted in trust and mutual understanding. As we walk this path, Remember that every interaction is an opportunity to practice the qualities we cherish. Each moment offers a chance to sow seeds of peace, to build bridges, and to heal divides. If you found value in this journey, I invite you to join our growing community. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and let's continue exploring the profound wisdom of Buddhism together. Your insights and experiences enrich us all. Together, we can create a ripple of harmony that extends far beyond any single conversation, touching hearts and transforming lives.